Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of HAMAA Reads. So, this week we are focusing on the Afrocentric idea. Today, I have with me two more of our council members. Please introduce yourselves, guys, and what you are to the organization.
Hi, I'm Mansa. That's how most of you would know me. I am the acting president and chief operations officer of HAMAA. Um, I make the little bits go and work with everybody to bring you guys all of the amazing things that this amazing team has put together.
Hello, I'm Henry. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for HAMA. I'm just making sure that the bills are paid and lights stay on.
My name is Samuel Godwin, active vice president for the Historical African Martial Arts Association. So since the second verse same as the first, we are going to take some time to read about the Afrocentric idea, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time discussing it. Same rules apply. Um, Comments are open for discussion, but we encourage scholarly conversation and no inappropriate discussions or comments in the comment section. Um, Feel free to add whatever question that you may have about the literature that we're discussing today. But other than that, just have us in the background. Grab yourself a cup of Joe, maybe a little snack, and enjoy. So, Manson will be providing the context for today's reading, as well as we're going to get a chance to read a couple of chapters in this reading, and we're going to discuss it. So, Mansa, take it away.
All right, so today we are talking about Afrocentrism. Now, there's a lot of buzz on social media about what Afrocentrism is, who Afrocentrists are, and so we thought we'd take an opportunity to take a look at what the roots of Afrocentrism are, especially since it's an important driver of how we do our research. So, the concept of Afrocentrism is actually born in the United States in the late 19th century. This is an outcrop of African Americans receiving their freedom after the end of the American Civil War. And this is where you start to see a lot of these enclaves of Black communities building together, focusing on their own community, their own culture, their own identity within the larger scope of the United States. And this generally was sort of the idea of whenever you are dealing with people of African extraction, in this context, mostly African Americans, then we are looking at what their views, their values, and their biases are in that situation. Now, this is not diametrically opposed to Eurocentrism, which is a privileging of European ideas. Instead, it is more the inclusion of, and this is further developed in the 1980s by Dr. Molefi Asante, who was a professor, I believe, in Philadelphia, who wrote a book, The Afrocentric Idea, and some other texts on the roots of Afrocentrism, and he refined the idea. And essentially, what he said, and I'm going to encapsulate this as best I can, is that whenever we talk about politics, history, social issues, anything along those lines where African descended people are involved, we take a look at what the Africans are saying. So this isn't to throw out the baby with the bathwater if we are looking at comparing it to a Eurocentrist viewpoint of an event in history. But instead, we accept that the Eurocentrist view is going to have biases, and we use the Afrocentric approach to check those biases, to make sure that we are giving an even-handed review of the research being looked at. And so for HAMAA, we look at this as an important part of our research because we want to know what the Africans are saying wherever possible about the martial arts and the military history. And we don't look at this as a race-based approach. We look at this as, does this come from the continent of Africa? Are the people that we are consulting actual Africans in this situation? Are they from a civilization? Are they within that culture? What is their experience with the events, and did they write or say anything about it? Or are there sort of cultural externalities that we can look at from those events or from those issues and apply that to the research that we do have?
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
So, let's proceed with the reading.
All right. So today we are going to be reading, let me get the full title here because it's fairly long. We're going to be reading so the title of this paper is called Molefi Asante, the Afrocentric Idea and the Cultural Turn in Intercultural Communication Studies, written by Reynaldo Anderson in St. Louis. This is from the International Journal of Intercultural Relations. So this is going to be a paper about Molefi Asante's ideas on Afrocentrism. Our focus today will be chapter 6, and this will be the emergence of the theoretical development of Afrocentricity. The PDF is available online for anyone who wants to read it. I believe it's also been posted in the HAMAA group. So if you are in our Facebook group, it should be there for you to read and download for yourself. So the section that we'll be reading is the emergence of the theoretical development of Afrocentricity. We won't be reading it in its entirety, but we will be reading it to sort of get an idea as to how Afrocentrism is used and sort of the emergence of it in the development of modern Afrocentricity. So without further ado, let's begin. All right. Afrocentric metatheory, Africology, and the contemporary study of Africanity, emerged in the latter 20th century during this Western existential crisis. Afrocentricity is a theory of social change and seeks agency and action. Furthermore, in regard to communication studies, the Afrocentric idea metatheory focuses on the structure and power of rhetorical conditions in relation to societal norms and analytically focuses on the frame of mind, scope of context, structure of code, and delivery of the message. This is a quote from Asante's 1980 paper. Finally, Africology is the transgenerational and transcontinental study of the African phenomenon, and Africanity is focused on the customs, traditions, and traits of the people of Africa and its diaspora. The rise of Afrocentricity, Afrocentric metatheory, and Africology as a serious mode of inquiry in theory and praxis in the 1990s stepped into the ideological vacuum of liberalism and faced challenges from the political right and left. In particular, committed conservative and liberal Eurocentric academics, New Democrats, and postmodern intellectuals of the various categories, including feminists, queer theorists, and others. However, these challenges were representative of the ideological denial of Western or Western-influenced intelligentsia in the context of the paradox of liberalism and its internal contradictions. First, in relation to the Eurocentric academia, the Afrocentric or Africological movement in the West, particularly in the American context, questioned previously established epistemological assumptions about the construction of knowledge and who benefits from such knowledge. One example of the phenomena is the utilization of Afrocentric epistemology, which argues that from the historical redemption of African Americans, it must begin with the agency of African people instead of Europeans. For that example, the knowledge produced by European intellectuals such as British philosopher David Hume and his essay on national character, German philosopher George Hegel in his lectures on history, and US President Thomas Jefferson in his text Notes on Virginia, to name just a few, are part of the corpus of this racist, sexist, and anti-African work that form Western Enlightenment, and are part of a large body of work that form a powerful academic pseudoscience and social political cultural tradition in regards to humanity and agency of Africans, and provide elite motif of underlying pattern for the global formation of white supremacy. Therefore, the Afrocentric perspective that emerged in the wake of the late 20th century, and this was a natural human intellectual response to the cultural imposition and biases by Eurocentric theorists and their sympathizers. Afrocentricity's intellectual precursor, negritude, developed by President of Senegal Leopold Senghor and others, was an earlier attempt to critique bastions of Eurocentric hegemony, but was utilized primarily in the realm of literary inquiry. The basic assumption of this underlying Afrocentric worldview and the notion of human nature or unity as the affinity for peace, harmony, self-knowledge, agency, and liberation among its proponents. This is a quote from Baldwin. Let's see here. The ethos reflective of this assumption is that oneness or harmony with nature and survival of the group. However, Scholars such as Lefkowitz and Stephen Howe have accused Afrocentric scholars of being racist or anti-white. However, Afrocentricity in its theory and praxis is anti-oppression and is an intellectual movement that has created space for the intellectual study of Africa and its diaspora in relation to the other cultural paradigms. Also, Afrocentricity calls into question Eurocentric analysis and study that poses as a universal hegemony. In regards to Afrocentricity, Asante notes, so this is a direct quote from Molefi Asante. It has made it possible for us to see that agency, location, and centrality of those experiences are all keys to human interactions. We have to see people from their perspective rather than impose ours on them. They are subjects, agents, and actors in human history and not simply to be used, acted upon, or treated as victims. And in this regard, Afrocentricity has become a major theoretical intervention in the study of communication, sociology, social work, philosophy, and literature. Secondly, the emergence of the post-Cold War 1990s neoliberal discourse surrounding the issue of race would be characterized by the attempts of academics and the electoral calculations of the New Democrat politicians to suppress race as part of public discourse. Therefore, Afrocentricity was attacked, and viciously so, as other programs of liberal redress, such as affirmative action, based on the reactionary critiques and related assertions of reverse racism. In one example of the tension surrounding the ideological denial of the era, historian Arthur Schleusner, in his book, The Disuniting of America from 1992, characterizes particular forms of multiculturalism or Afrocentrism as problematic and confuses hyperbole related to ethnicity with actual historical facts. This is a quote again from Asante. Furthermore, New Democrat politicians or political discourse was characterized by advocating the false universal reform, and it dismisses or suppresses the effects of racism and its underlying tensions. For example, New Democrat politician Bill Clinton, informed by one of the works of sociologist William Julius Wilson, author of The Truly Disadvantaged and Conservative Politics of the Reagan-Bush Era, into more benign politics of redistribution. Third, in relation to the ideological denial of the West, external critiques from nominally progressive Eurocentric scholars in other paradigms and internal pressure from Black scholars and various ideological influences currently engage in the Afrocentric school of thought. However, in the interest of parsimony, the remainder of the essay shall focus on the internal conflicts within Afrocentric studies, challenges, and possible new directions for Afrocentric meta-theory in relation to communication studies. So that's the first part, talking about some of the challenges that Afrocentrism has had to deal with as an ideology and its pushback in academia. So what do you guys think about what we've read so far?
Not much has changed. Actually, it does shine a light onto certain stuff and why certain people have like their own like negative perspective, especially when we dive into like the political realm. You know, a lot of it is like targeting like the liberal mindset and the contradictions, but the contradictions found within that political perspective. But then at the same time, it's like, I think, does he still recognize like a conservative effort or like a I don't know, I guess you could say like, does he still recognize like there's like a conservative aspect to it that also gets in the way of that, and also like kind of like sullies the name of Afrocentrism and what it's meant to be?
Yeah, in the paper, he does talk about some of the pushback in the idea of reverse racism, or the idea that in some of the critiques of Afrocentrist ideas that are named in the text here, they do write about Afrocentrism being a racist approach. And of course, allegations of reverse racism, which is usually politically a conservative political tactic, right? So he does talk about that, and just sort of the idea that Afrocentrist theory directly butts up against conservative ideas of African identity and history, and in all of the different aspects of research.
as I see it, there's still the kind of disconnect, and one side playing against the other. The Democrats, Republicans, however you want to put it, conservative, liberal. Um, they both kind of play into the one-sidedness of the argument. How it's going to be somewhat racist, but less racist if we look at it this way. And the other side is, hey, we can't allow this because it is racist. There's no ground level understanding that's being pushed of, hey, we need the whole story, so let's consider all sources, which is where we should be. But because of all of the structures in place, we can't have that right now.
Right. It's almost like a I've always thought of that. I thought about it like this before, but I always thought it was like a sabotaging. It's almost like actually, yeah, just sabotage, subterfuge. There we go, subterfuge. I always thought it was like subterfuge because because this kind of conversation, is an uncomfortable conversation, and there's ways to covertly detract from the point because it's uncomfortable. When we talk about Afrocentrism, we've already had so many different ideas and perspectives and theories of the past that has contributed to the the African and diasporic conversation worldwide thus far, and it's these kind of conversations you don't know how people are going to actually implement, like these think tanks, like you don't know what they're going to do, because we've already had a past of civil rights movements. We already had a past of radical movements that have happened because of the fact of that adverse experience, and of course certain people are going to go in any kind of direction when they've been oppressed enough, whether they are going to either do extreme civil disobedience, like they're going to literally take the punches until somebody recognizes okay, this is not wrong, this is not right, or they're going to fight back. And I think that that's what a lot of individuals who already have this in the back of their head already are operating on white supremacy. I know we didn't talk about that yet, but already operating on white supremacy and Eurocentrism. They already kind of have this feeling and that's actually when you talk to them, that's what they think. It's like if given the chance, what are they going to do? And so when we have these conversations, we will hear reverse racism. We will hear this is racist. This is almost like black supremacy. We will start to coin those kind of terms and try to make it slowly but surely make it seem like it's a almost like a thing that you don't really want to talk about, like it's an ick, like it's something that is cringe, like you don't really want to dive into this. You want to do that so much so that people themselves start to be gaslit and accept the fact that this is something that is not okay, or this is something that is not something that we should pursue. And it contributes to this intellectual dishonesty that you see a lot that goes on with these kind of discussions about learning from the source, learning from the people, understanding their stories, understanding their experiences. That's my 2 cents.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I agree. I think that at the end of it, or at least, and we'll probably get into this when Henry reads the next section, but sort of the idea that Afrocentrism often gets conflated with pseudo-intellectuals who like to make things up and who just kind of decide that to put an African label on everything without any real background research, which then results in the baby getting thrown out with the bathwater, right? Or the fact that Afrocentrism often gets mischaracterized as this direct balance to Eurocentrism, where you go all the way in the other direction when talking about, all of the different subjects that we talk about relating to Africans. I also think what is particularly interesting is the idea that Afrocentrism is race-based only, when it doesn't necessarily consider that. I mean, if you take a look at, say, you want to read something about what happened in North Africa during the Libyan War for Independence, right? An Afrocentrist approach is to find out what the Libyans are saying, regardless of what race those Libyans are, to get their perspective on what happened during their war for independence.
Mhm.
Uh, and the same thing goes for Algerians or Egyptians, or the whole conversation of whether or not Mamluks were African or not, or whether the Mamluk army was an African army or not. If it was in Africa, if it contained Africans, if it is part of an institution in an African country, it is African, maybe less so than more indigenous forms or more indigenous systems or more indigenous peoples, but it still falls under the umbrella. And we have to be able to wrestle with that when we do our research, whether we like the outcome of that information or not.
Right.
But see, that also brings up a lot of the things how Northern Africa is separated out with history and things like that.
Right.
How a lot of people don't consider Egypt part of Africa. How it's been related to us via history books and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have a long hill to climb in order to be recognized with some of the things that we say and do as far as our research. And it's because we're fighting against some of these biases. Um, because so many of the things that are out right now, and so many of the history books are written, are from a European perspective, and they don't have, and they never had another perspective to look at other
Mm-hmm.
than that. So when we challenge that, it's, oh my God, so you're telling us everything that we've done is wrong, or everything that we've learned
Yeah,
is wrong, and we're fighting against that, and like I said, it's a hard road. It's
definitely
gonna
a hard
take
road.
it's gonna take time to kind of overcome that because we have to modify some ways of thinking, and that is the process that's going to take the most effort because
Well,
we have to, in a way, explain to them, no, you're not 100% wrong. You're just coming at it from this perspective. So let's open this up. Let's have discourse. Let's talk about it because whether we like it or not, at some point we need to hear every side of the story.
this is
But
true.
people are so in line and only want to hear their side, the side that refers directly to them. But that's kind of like human nature.
Yeah.
You view yourself as the center of the world, so you
Mm-hmm.
want s- everything to revolve around you. Everything that you learn has to connect to you in some way. So
Yeah.
you're hesitant towards reaching out and connecting with someone else and seeing someone else's point of view because that takes away from your point,
Yeah.
which is
You're
not the
100%
goal.
right.
Which is not the goal of what is going on with this movement.
You are 100% right. So, do we want to move on to the next section?
Okay,
All right, Henry, please take it away.
so at the same time, there's a paradox in Western liberal democracy between market liberalism and political liberalism. The same crisis is reflected within African post-colonial society and the Black diaspora's state cultural formations in general. That is, a broad consensus formed in early 20th century began to break down during the late 1960s period of post-colonial independence. Passage of civil rights legislation, the formal end of apartheid in South Africa in the 1990s, ideas ranging from philosophy consensusism of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the revolutionary theory and praxis of Franz Fanon Martinique in Algeria, and African socialism or Ujema of Julius Nyerere of Tanzania are practiced in relation to decolonization. In particular, continental African diasporic leaders, individuals, and activists struggled to theoretically address the needs of their constituents as their societies changed and were responding to the early stages of post post-colonial, post-industrial era. For example, in an American context, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King attempted to resolve the paradox to their assassinations, or prior to their assassinations. Sorry, there were among the dominant figures at the time, along with Franny Lou Hamer, Vicky Garvin, Bernard or Baynard Rustin, Gloria Richardson, Robert F. Williams, James Baldwin, Max Stafford, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, George Jackson, Angela Davis, Amari Bakra, uh, Mylena Kargana. I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names.
That's
Many of the
happens to all of us.
and many others that attempted to address the Harold Cruz called "Crisis of the Negro Intellectual" in 1967. Cruz noted in regard to American polity and the Constitution recognizes the rights and privileges and aspirations of the individual, but those political institutions recognize the reality of ethnic groups only during election contests. Even every 4 years, the great fiction of the assimilated African ideal is put aside to deal with the pluralistic reality of hyper-stated society, drawing upon drawing upon the historical. Oh no, hold on. Let me go back because I skipped. Okay,
I think you're on the hyphenated
yes.
years, or the hyphenated American vote.
Oh, yes. The okay. So go back to the beginning of that sentence. Every 4 years, the great fiction of the assimilated American ideal is put aside to deal with the pluralistic reality of the hyphenated American vote. Cruz makes this argument in an essay entitled Individualism and the Open Society, drawing upon historical conditions of the African Americans and the work of socialist Milton Gordon and C. Wright Mills to frame the argument for the political necessity for the politically necessary strategy of group identity in relation to pluralistic American politics. More precisely, Cruz goes on to state that the United States, a nation dominated by groups, social power of groups, classes, and in-group and cliques. The individual American has very few rights that are not backed up by a political, economical, social power of one group or another. In this matter, the paradox of liberal orthodoxy and its crisis has engaged by supporters has been engaged by supporters of the Afrocentric meta theory, Black studies, Black feminists, postmodern cultural studies, and academics, and recently Black queer theorists. In relation to Afrocentricity, Black studies, or an Afrologic, Black feminists have legitimate claims to masculine forms of scholarship and discrimination in the discipline. The institutional practice and theoretical underdevelopment, these claims are valid, and Black feminist scholars in the face of sorry,
Hmm.
sorry, okay, so these claims are valid, and the Black feminist scholars in the face of these obstacles have made significant contributions to the field of Black studies and communication studies. However, the fact remains that overwhelmingly most Black women scholars and Black women in general do not identify as feminists with feminist theories and praxis due to the fact that Historical treatment of women of European descent does not mirror construction of gender of in the African diaspora community. Furthermore, the tenuous dependency model relationships that some black feminist scholars have with white feminist matriarchy is its fraternal partner, white male patriarchy, and the post-humanist conceptualization of black women activists and feminists continue to undermine intellectual uh,
Fecundity.
fecundity. Thank you. Intradependency and creatively of feminist theory. The praxis, similarly, the Afrocentric schools of thought received severe criticism from postmodern and post-racial theorists on cultural studies and scholars.
So this is really interesting. Um, when in this particular part, as I understand it, he's talking about more of the ways that you find Afrocentricity bumping up against ostensibly progressive ideals, right? The concept of focusing on the African view of, talking about feminism, how there is an African version of how we should look at feminist theory, as opposed to assuming the feminist theory in the Western concept, because the things that I guess African women will be addressing in an African concept, in the African context, will be very different from the struggles that women will be dealing with in a Western or European context, or even within the ethnic enclaves of Africans within a European context, and how those questions might butt up against each other. What do you guys think about that?
It's funny because like I wouldn't say that I had it's been a minute since I've been in college, but like I remember like how I went to Temple University, and Temple University it is a very diverse school, and although like there were many types of like there's many types of political ideologies, there are people who come from many different backgrounds and such. It was definitely like presenting itself, especially as like more of a leftist school, despite the fact that there was still discourse and people who were creating discourse on either side, as well as other perspectives that came into play. Whoever was actually passionate about like whatever topics that we talk about in the realm of sociology and everything else. When we sit here and we talk about like just the I think we could just sum it up with intersectionality, right? Because with intersectionality, it's the fact that you are understanding that how your different identities puts you in different systems of oppression. I may be explaining
Right.
that wrong, but I think people kind of get the gist of that. When you are talking to a white woman, she does fall under that system of oppression under the patriarchy, but it's not the same as a black woman who goes not only under the under the patriarchy, but also she's black, so she now finds herself in that under that system of oppression that is introduced by racism and so on and so forth. And then we start to add more people from the LGBT, and you start to have this whole different system and blah 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 blah. And we identity is very complex, and we
Mhm.
understand. I think what's interesting about that is what he's pointing out is that even within like the conversation, especially on feminism, black women cannot join within the larger scope of the larger scope of feminism because of the fact that like that larger scope is very Eurocentric and it's very westernized, and that is like and that a lot of the times, more times than not, historically speaking, does not include them. And it's a terrible thing because you see the impact of that, where when it comes down to social justice reforms and advocacy that were designed to care for women, it wasn't including black women or other women of color in that fight. And like just to have like black study scholars and many of them to point that out is again going back to the whole progressive, that the contradictions within certain progressives, it was a thorn in their side. It was something that was very uncomfortable for them to hear.
Uh-huh. No, absolutely. What do you think, Henry?
Okay, so the struggle of the African female in the diaspora as well as the States is so set aside from those of the feminist movement, primarily because, as stated before, the differences are tremendous. Where the the white female feminist, has a little more dependence and prosperity under the patriarchy. The black female in the diaspora were so put down and so, how do I put this, so held down by the patriarchy that the struggle doesn't even begin on an even basis. So in order to connect with the feminist movement would take an almost nullifying of self to get to a level where the two kind of coexist.
Well, and I think taking this back to our field of study, right? I think one of the key things that they're driving at here is that not just that being of African extraction within a Eurocentrist society, regardless of whether we are speaking about feminism, philosophy, sociology, what have you, is that there are distinct cultural differences and perspectives within those communities. Take, for example, the use of oral history. So if we'll take it back to that, right? One of my favorite examples is always the example of Great Zimbabwe, where you have these explorers from Europe in the 19th century who see these ruins in the middle of an area where they didn't think people were building large stone structures, right? And for the benefit of the viewers, Great Zimbabwe was a major trade city in the 1500s and during the medieval era. That was this hub or the center of trade in southern Africa. They found pottery from as far away as China in the site. And it was built by the Shona people who live in the region and essentially fell out of use when the trade stopped coming in. So when the trade stopped coming in, the city fell into ruins, just like any other city in any other civilization anywhere. Scholars from Europe, the name is escaping me right now, went to the site and assumed that this great stone structure was not built by these Africans living in huts and didn't bother asking them about their history, but instead was looking for evidence of written history. Now, again, we're talking about a people who historically have used stories, poems, and specialists within their community who would be in charge of maintaining the history, and also the use of particular objects that are representative of dynasties, kings, what have you. And so rather than speaking to the people, he went and believed that this was built by some long lost Phoenician society, or perhaps it was built by the Queen of Sheba, or which is another conversation when we talk about ethnicity and history, etc. And so they dug up the site, and the more they dug, the more African artifacts they found. And they damaged a significant portion of the site, looking for evidence that it was not built by Africans. Meanwhile, the Shona people who lived in the neighborhood, who still had many of the objects in everyday use that they found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, were trying to tell them that this was our old city and this is what happened to it. Here was the king that was in charge, etc., so on and so forth. But because the Eurocentric view privileges writings and other means of recording information in a way that is common in Europe, other systems of recording this information were largely disregarded. And so for years, all of this information was just not being taken down in the main locus of the world of academia. And on top of that, you ended up with a priceless historical site getting damaged. And so there's lost knowledge there. And so when we talk about all of these other things, we need to also consider the cultural perspective. So drawing it back to the conversation about the inclusion of, say, for example, women in African martial arts, African history, and the discussions of feminism, we have to understand that within African-centered communities, regardless of what part of the continent or diaspora you are from, women in our societies have different roles. Many of us come from matriarchal communities where the leaders of our family are not men but women, where the chief educators in our families are women and not men, where the leaders of our armies in many cases are women, where we have whole, not mythical like the Amazons of Greece, but like actual women who have military units and ranks and leadership and power, and who wrote down bits of history, or who themselves are griots who recite the stories of our history and our kings, etc.
Yeah.
And so when we look for great leaders in African history, we aren't looking for women who were replaced by men or led by men. We are looking for the women who also were standing beside and many times in front of the men in their communities. And I think that's also an important part of Afrocentrism, that we understand that when we look at women in our society, that our cultures, depending on where you come from, all have a different perspective on the roles of women within those cultures. And all of those come with different challenges. All of those come with different requirements. All of those come with, different forms of oppressions or expectations. And just taking a blanket view of the Western world on how they view women in society and their tropes and their history doesn't quite map over 100%. And so the Afrocentrist approach would be to make sure that we look at all aspects of the way that women are viewed in the various cultures.
I actually like concur with you on this one because the continent of Africa, not the country for those ignoramuses out there. The continent of Africa is a huge continent with many different people, and even if you were to take out the border, because a lot of the borders that we see now are a product of post-colonialism.
Right.
I could attest to that with Nigeria. My dad is Igbo. And there, like a lot of the boundaries and borders that were established were post-colonial. If you take those away, you can see that there's a vast diversity of ethnic people, and a lot of them have like different ideas and perspectives. Which again, if for like some of us who would love to romanticize Africa, who like to have this this particular image of Africa, would either associate it with one of the two, either the matriarchy or the patriarchy. They associate it with this and that, and they kind of paint Africa in this broad brush when Africa is so diverse. It's so many different people that's doing so many different things, just like everybody else everybody else in the world. We have a diversity of people just on the continent alone in and of itself. And it even goes beyond just skin color. There is a lot of things that we do, a lot of ways we perspective, and also on top of that too, there's a lot of things that we have in common. We could just start off with the language in and of itself. Yeah. Sometimes a lot of our languages come from a root, like a root form. I'm not going to say that I'm very knowledgeable of that though, but I will say like it. There are from my little bit of research and study, like a lot of ethnic groups had a group from which they came from. And again, going back to the Igbo, community, the Igbo community is like a confederation of so many like different diverse communities and villages. And the way they do things, because of the fact that they're not centralized, they do things so differently. Lord only knows where my dad came from. He says he's from Abia State. My dad doesn't necessarily give me too much information about stuff like that. And when he does, it's just to show off, whatever. But either way, he Lord only knows like where my dad came from and how it was before British colonialization. But from what I understand is that there were a lot of times when certain communities had both men and women like equally involved with the organization of their communities. They were involved in the markets. They were involved in the distribution of resources. They were involved in the the policies for their community. They were very active members of the community, and they looked upon each other as equal.
Mhm.
And Lord only knows how many other communities were like that. Heck, we could even talk about the Tuareg. The Tuareg are definitely matriarchy. The women, you have to give the men permission to be able to come and lodge in their tents.
Mhm.
Like that, there's just so many different what's it called? There's so many different communities and cultures that we haven't even like grasped, we haven't even touched the surface on yet. And then the last thing that I want to mention, like the Shona, when you were talking about like those stone structures, it resonated with me because of the fact that it reminds me of Nubia. It reminds me of the um, the many like ancient cities within Nubia, and just the mere fact that Nubia was a rival to Egypt. Yet, for some reason, like Henry had mentioned, they want to remove Egypt from like African history. Um, but like it's funny how like Egypt and Nubia were like in constant competition when they were in their heydays with each other, and Nubia was producing like about the same amount of pyramids as Egypt was. But then that preservation, that concentration on preserving the history of Nubia is not the same as the way that they try to preserve and study and
Mhm.
overstudy ancient Egypt. And it's funny to me because like when you were talking about like how they're going into these stone structures in the Great Zimbabwe and are literally damaging it. It's the same thing that's going on with the pyramids in Nubia, where it's just
Mhm.
straight up just don't like necessarily respect it, and they're just letting it just rot away, and there's no preservation effort that's being put into it.
Well, I think that just sort of dovetailing to that, part of the issue that I believe is leading with the overstudy of Egypt is that Egypt itself has sort of captured the Western mind,
Mm.
right? Um, I mean, when you hear people talk about Egypt, what's the first name you hear? It's Cleopatra,
Yeah.
right? Egypt being the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, the source of its papyrus, right? The corridor to all of the luxury goods that the Roman elites loved, the tortoise shells, the precious stones, the animal skins, all of these things that they couldn't get in Europe and maybe couldn't get in the western part of Northern Africa, but they were able to get through Egypt's access to trade with modern day Somalia and modern day Sudan and the places further south.
Mm-hmm.
And so, also, the challenge is that when Egypt is often researched, it's looked at from the perspective of Greece and Rome, and not the perspective of Kush or the Garamantes or the Abyssinians or the Punts or the Punt people or the people of Punt, sorry. And so we end up missing part of the context for Egyptian culture. There was a video that I did some years ago about random things that you find in ancient Egypt that exist in other parts of Africa. And the more you learn about these things, the more you see how African Egypt was. And
Mm-hmm.
again, this isn't a comment on the color of the people living in the country, but we're looking at the culture, right? Their entire existence was tied to an African river. Their closest border was with, they may have shared a border with the Levant, but two out of their three land borders were with African nations, Libya and Kush. Their mercenaries were mostly from Nubia. Their language is Afro-Asiatic. And Afro-Asiatic languages, Proto-Afro-Asiatic specifically, is born in the Ethiopian highlands. Their tradition of drinking beer from a jug with a straw is still practiced today in Kenya, right? The headrests that they wore, the hairstyles that they preferred are still worn by the Afar people today. Some of the jewelry that they had, you still see in some beadworks of some different tribal societies. Their stick fighting systems are still practiced by the Nuer and the Saidi, and you see versions of it in the Ethiopian highlands as well. So it's just, there is so much about Egypt that is African without talking about the color of the people living there. That when you take an Afrocentrist perspective, certain things about Egyptian culture, even the way that they write, their preferences for women and all of these different things, all start to make a bit more sense. One of my favorite examples is there was a poem that I read that I can't remember. I think it may be called "Oh Sweet Sister." I think that's the name of it. But there's a whole section in that poem where all he talks about is the thickness of this woman's thighs. And without, and this is sort of I mean, I'm being a bit cheeky here, right? But this is also part of the beauty standard of many of the different neighboring cultures. So their beauty standards were African, their art was African, the tools they used every day were African, the hairstyles that they preferred were African, and those were all either from Egypt and maybe Egypt influencing its neighbors, but also to a degree it was the Egyptians being influenced by their neighbors. They even talk about how much of their culture comes from Tesseti, or the Egyptian, Upper Egypt or up the Nile, right? Egypt's first nationalists, Scorpion II, I believe, who ruled in pre-unified southern Egypt, was a nationalist who did not want foreign, specifically Mesopotamian influences on his region of, I don't remember what they called it, just something, whatever they called Upper Egypt at the time, but didn't want those foreign influences on his region of Egypt, right? And that was a generation before King Scorpion went north and conquered the northern part of Egypt. So I think trying to look at Egypt through its African neighbors and trying to understand it through its commonalities with those neighbors, I think gives us a more profound understanding, at least for the layperson, in learning about that. And trying to not throw out everything we've learned about Egypt through European scholars, but try to analyze it with the lens of, as best you can, of course, of people who are from those places. Yeah. What do you think, Henry?
I actually agree with what you said. You can't say you know about a culture if you're only looking at one information source. You can't say you know about anything if you're only looking at one information source. The ability to broaden your perspective, get more than one source for your information, is going to give you a more complete picture. We're running and we're trying to present that. And in that, we're going to get that pushback from people that only want to see one perspective. They want to keep it simple and neat for them to look at. But we all know world history isn't a pretty picture.
Yeah, this is true.
One avenue of information is not going to give you a world view of that area. I'll take it to, say, World War II.
Right.
Are you going to look at just the German perspective when it comes down to World War II? No, you're going to look at the Italian perspective. You're going to look at the American perspective, Europe. You're going to look at everybody's perspective of what happened in that battle. With Afrocentrism, we're putting out there, hey, this is a perspective that we need to look at. This is a perspective that helps us form a complete picture. And we need to have that more commonplace in the areas of discussion.
I agree. Even in that vein, when we talk about World War II, one of my favorite examples of this is the difference between the way that European sources will take a look at the Second Italo-Ethiopian War and the way that Ethiopian sources will take a look at the Italo-Ethiopian War. From the Western perspective, the Italo-Ethiopian War was over in a year, and Italy occupied Ethiopia, and that was it, right? And Ethiopia was then liberated by Britain or retaken. But if you take a look at the Ethiopian perspective, they never looked at the war being over in 1936, when the army was mostly dissipated and the emperor went into exile. Instead, they look at it as a years-long resistance until 1941, which was part of the wider locus of World War II. The fact that Italy would say that it took over all of Ethiopia when it really only controlled the major cities and didn't control the highlands or the countryside. They controlled, I think, maybe 40% They had actual control over 40% of Ethiopia, but not the rest of it. The fact that there was an entire province, I believe it was Gondor province, that was the center of the revolution, where there were still members of the royal family, where there were still members of the warrior classes, where there were still military commanders organizing resistance movements. The fact that there was an army that was ready on the ground when Britain arrived, or when Britain arrived in 1941 with weapons, with a resupply, with all of the other gear. And the fact that the Ethiopians, even though the British did help them get their liberation from the Italians, that much of that fighting was done by Ethiopians themselves. So if you look at it from the Ethiopian perspective, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War was a part of wider World War II. It was a war that lasted not from 35 until 36, but 35 until 41. And that Italy never truly controlled Ethiopia beyond the major cities that it targeted. Whereas you look at from the Western perspective, and it will say that the war was over in a year, the emperor was exiled, and Ethiopia was part of, depending on the political leaning of the person you're having the conversation with, they will say either it was occupied by Italy or it was part of the greater Italian empire and was fully colonized by Italy. And that they were liberated by Britain. Not that they were helped by Britain, not that they were resupplied, not that they got reinforcements, but they got liberated by Britain and Britain alone. And that gives you two very different pictures of a conflict, that there are still people alive today who have experienced it. So it's just interesting to see from that perspective. And I think the Afrocentrist perspective may not necessarily replace the entire perspective of what was of the European perspective, of the Western perspective of that war between Italy and Ethiopia. But I think considering what the Ethiopians have to say about the conflict and considering what the Western sources have to say about the conflict, putting those two things together will give us a better picture of what actually went on. Because at the end of the day, history is just us cobbling together a bunch of random events and trying to make a coherent story out of it.
Right. Yep. And then on top of that too, it's where do we go from here? Because we always talk about, like, if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. But I really don't think, I think there's a little bit more complexity with that. It's the fact that a lot of people read up on their history, but it's the mere fact that, like, what do you do with that? How do you go from here? Because we know about wars, we know about we know that their impact, we know about revolutions, we know about their impact, we know about the things that happen within it, how the people, the different kind of calamities and tragedies that happen as these really monumentous changes happen within nations and stuff like that. And some people are still warmongers, even though they know and read about these things and realize, like, how detrimental it can be. Yet it's merely not simply just the fact that if we just learn from our history, but if we learn to understand and analyze it a lot better, and how we implement those things going forward in the future, whether we are involved in politics, whether we're involved within our communities, whether we're involved in just the conversation at large. Like, it's really just a matter of how do we go about it? What do we do? And like, again, like, that's something that is that's a very subjective, like, perspective on, like, the value of that, right? Because some people will say, like, we don't need to research on this kind of stuff. I don't care about Afrocentricity, which is that's a diversity that happens amongst even a lot of, like, the Black community. It's just that some people will embrace Afrocentricity while other people embrace pro-Blackness. Other people will embrace, like, Western ideology, or just people just say, like, forget this stuff, man. I'm just trying to live my life. What's the whole point of learning this stuff? And we all gonna understand and acknowledge, like, this diversity in thought. But it's also a matter of fact of, like, okay, what we're gonna do after this? What are we going to do after this? Like, how are we going to implement these things that we have learned? Where are we going to go? What are the next steps? So that all of us get a chance to to get everything that we need in order to survive. To even if we're not waiting for all of the community to understand its worth, how do I create that worth, that value in myself as someone of African descent, as a Black person, as someone who is trying to navigate the world and this, trying to navigate the Western world or this Eurocentric society? Those are my closing remarks. Do you guys have any other closing remarks before we go?
I guess the only thing I will say is take time, study, look at as many sources as possible, and try to think outside of the box, and understanding that if all of your sources are coming from one place, maybe you're not getting the whole story.
Henry?
My closing, okay? Understanding Afrocentrism as part of a larger thing with humanizing people. We need to see each other's point of view. If we don't understand each other's point of view, we'll never fully unify. And that is a level that we need to come forth and we need to unify to an extent and identify with the next person's struggle. And if we're not taking the next person's struggle into acknowledgement, we're not really ever going to bridge that gap between us. And that's it.
Oh, all right. All right, fellas. This was a very thought-provoking conversation. This is a very, like a very interesting topic to talk about. Sometimes, it can be, I wouldn't necessarily say divisive, but it can be definitely, it can definitely be provoking, for lack of better terms. But I'm glad that we actually had like this really intellectual conversation that hopefully will spark a lot more intellectual and academic conversation going forward into the future. But thank you guys for coming on today.
No problem.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having
And for everybody who is watching, thank you for tuning in. Next week, we will be talking about, which one was it again, Adam?
We'll be doing The Land of Seon, so a 13th century chronicle about a war between Abyssinia and the Ifat Sultanate.
All right, so we are going to be diving into Abyssinia from the perspective of an Abyssinian chronicler, keeping up with the same spirit of Afrocentricity. So we're looking forward to seeing you guys there in the next episode. Everybody have a great day. Stay blessed.